Hi, I'm Asby Brown, and I want to say first that I'm really thrilled to be here, and I extend my gratitude to the organizers and sponsors and all of you people who found energy to come here this morning to hear this presentation. As Roseanne mentioned, I've lived in Japan for over 20 years. In fact, it's 25 years. I'm a native New Orleanian, and I think my first interest in architecture and planning in cities arose from the neighborhoods I grew up in and learned to love. I found myself in Japan to study traditional temple carpentry. I was really interested in the craftsmanship and the history, the techniques and design involved in this incredibly high carpentry art. But after moving to Japan with a grant to study, like a lot of people who visit there, I became increasingly fascinated with contemporary Japan. And as an architect, designer myself, looking at these incredible constraints of space, the economics, again, the demographics, that the architects grappled with, and found that there was an incredible body of knowledge, an incredible storehouse of techniques and approaches to design that enabled good architects to really make remarkable transitions from what would ordinarily be cramped and uncomfortable living space into very livable and even attractive ways of living. My talk today is called The Way We Live Now, we being the globe, and in particular Japan, and thinking about recent advances in small home design. The core of my talk will really be about some recent projects by various architects, mostly in the Tokyo area, mostly since the year 2000. But I wanted to give a little background first. To me, this is a very resonant photograph. It's taken about 1952, which, as you know, is the really immediate post-war period. It was a bad time economically and socially for the country in many ways. But this is a happy family. This is a multi-generational family. There appears to be a grandmother, a mother, several children. I would imagine this is the afternoon tea time, time for tea and crackers. If you look, you'll see that the room is really, it's falling apart. I mean, the wall is patched with newspaper. The window is cracked. There's a bare light bulb. This is a little hibachi heating unit, so perhaps it's winter. And yet, everyone's very comfortable. They appear to be comfortable. Maybe it's because they're having their picture taken, but there's a kind of togetherness and a way of occupying a space with other people that really, I think, is very meaningful to Japanese people. If you've ever visited, perhaps you've spent time in some very small little bars or places to drink where you're really hemmed in. And Japanese, despite the fact that there are aspirations for larger and more open living space, in many cases people are very, very comfortable with a kind of togetherness and closeness and real shoulder rubbing environment. So I guess the lesson I take from this photograph is that it's not the size of the space, it's how the space encourages and allows people to communicate, to share, to allow a certain kind of physical contact and conversation, togetherness, and also a certain degree of separateness. I've looked at the history of Japanese cities, in particular Tokyo, what was once known as Edo, and looked at how the historical roots of how they lived have affected how people design and live now. One thing to keep in mind, the entire city of Edo was filled with blocks and blocks of commercial streets that were occupied by the townspeople. And this would be the street frontage on one side of the block, this would be on the other side of the block, and there were long alleyways between them. Perhaps the landlord who owned this entire section of property would live in the largest house here and rent out these other houses, and then would build a number of tenements in the back. They're called nagaya, which means like long house. And these were essentially one-room living units. They had shared common space with a privy and a well, and place to do your laundry, and place for information gathering. And perhaps there were 10 units or more back here, and up to 2/3 or 3/4 of the urban population lived in these single-room tenements. To look at how they, the amount of space they had, we're looking at about 105 square feet for a family, basically what we consider a nuclear family, mother, father, and a child or two. Basically one room with a very basic kitchen. And It doesn't mean that the quality of life was bad. Of course, you'd have some that were in good condition and some that were falling apart, perhaps even slums. But overall, it was a good quality of life. People were in good health and participating in the economy and participating in a very lively social life. Even what we consider the upper class is the samurai. Rather, the low-ranking samurai, typical what we call a foot soldier, would have only about 426 square feet to live in. It had tatami mats, it had a slight kitchen, it had a few other amenities, but it was a very minimal dwelling from our standards. What we'd consider a middle-ranking samurai, like a professional class, they were basically salaried workers. They had more property, enough to have gardens, and they grew a lot of their own food, in fact. But their house itself was generally about 700, rarely up as much as 1,000 square feet. And a good portion of this was formal space for receiving the boss when he comes, which they would really not use for day-to-day living very much. The actual family spaces would be in the back. So even as you get higher up the economic and social scale, the dwellings were generally very small. Typical Kyoto townhouse, which would have been occupied by a merchant family, we're looking at one of about 1,000 square feet. It's a fairly generous size and larger than what you found in Edo. And the front couple of rooms, however, would be a shop. So you have to sort of subtract that from what you consider the living space. And they were very long and narrow, and this has certainly persisted into the current day. You occasionally had very large homes, particularly farmhouses. This is a multi-story house in an area called Gifu. But the thing to keep in mind about these is that they were multi-generational, often with household help also living under the same roof. And the upper floors, particularly in this region, were actually given over to silkworm raising. So these are actually productive spaces. The living space would be confined to the first floor. They're very large. They would last for a long time, but they were not really large in terms of living space. At the same time, an aesthetic developed that really prized the miniature, prized smallness and intimacy for its own virtues. Tea houses were actually kind of a self-conscious reinterpretation of farmer's hut. With the same kind of thatched roofs and mud walls. They were built by, of course, elite people who could afford quite more ostentatious and elaborate, places to entertain, but were consciously emulating what they saw as the virtues of the life of the farmer. So there began to be a very highly cultured approach toward miniature design. What we consider the shoin is a particular style. We think of it as the peak of Japanese residential architecture, with sliding screens, tatami mats on the floor. These are features that began in the aristocratic classes and eventually trickled down and allowed a very flexible, open, free plan with the ability to separate spaces and to reconfigure the space when necessary. Also, living on the floor became very, very comfortable. Tatami mats are really a wonderful place to sit or recline. We also saw the beginning of quite elaborate cabinetry, built-ins that are very decorative and also very functional. This kind of space would be a desk and perhaps actually used for writing. The lighting of this became very important. So we have the importance of controlling and modulating light to enhance the space itself. These built-ins, these flexible panels, a lot of wonderful techniques that are bequeathed to us by tradition for making living space wonderful. However, most Japanese don't live that way. This is a fairly typical Tokyo apartment. I imagine it's a single person, young male. The house has all those features, the sliding screens and everything, but you can't even see them. Space is very, very highly constrained in Japan, and it's become quite a challenge for design one that people have approached. The average Japanese home in 2003 was about 1,000, a little more than 1,000 square feet, and the average cost was about $400,000. Compare that to data, rental houses, however, are less than 500 apartments. And these would be apartments for families, in fact, less than 500 square feet. The average U.S. home from 2003, double the size and half the price. This is the real reality. Faced with some of these difficulties, certainly, just like I mentioned, despite this drive towards larger homes and this desire to live like Americans do, after the collapse of the economy in the early 90s, a lot of people sort of gave up the idea of having a home, but architects in particular sort of started to become, very innovative and came up with a lot of ways to make homes, make houses for people in places where you would think it would not be possible. And this is a very interesting one that sort of started a trend. It's called the Sumire Aoi House. That's the name of the children of the owners, otherwise known as the 9 tsubo house. And 1 tsubo is the area occupied by 2 tatami mats. So for instance, this is 9 tsubo, which works out to about 320 square feet. That's the footprint of the house. That's what it occupies on the ground. And the total floor area, because it has a good second floor, is about 500 square feet. This is a house by, a house for a nuclear family. It's 2 parents and 2 children. And it's actually quite livable. You can see it has a lot of these Japanese features. The ground floor is an open living space, and this is a tatami matted bedroom for the parents, and the children have sort of a loft sleeping space above. There's even room for a small office. The kitchen is very adequate. The bath is also adequate. One of the interesting things about this project is that it was actually a virtual replica of a house designed by Makoto Masazawa in the early post-war period in response to competitions to come up with new minimal dwellings to help Japanese rebuild their cities quickly. So it was really interesting that the economic crisis of the 1990s led to responses that were very similar to responses made after the total destruction of the cities during the Second World War. I'll look at